The winter wind howled through the mountains as Chase Dio gripped the rescue helicopter's harness, his eyes fixed on the ravine below. Through the swirling snow, he could see the faint glow of emergency flares marking where a family's car had plunged off the icy road. His best friend and fellow Air Force rescue specialist Mike Sullivan was already being lowered down, determined to reach the trapped survivors. 2 minutes until fuel critical, the pilot's voice crackled through the headset. Chase's heart pounded as he watched Mike reach the precariously balanced vehicle. 3 people inside, a mother and 2 children. Time was running out. "I've got him." Mike's voice came through strong and clear. Starting extraction, his words cut off as a sickening crack echoed through the canyon. The weakened cliff face, devastated by recent storms, began to give way. "Mike, get out of there," Chase screamed, but his friend was already securing the mother and children to his rescue line. Chase could see Mike's face in the helicopter spotlight, calm, focused, accepting. He knew he wouldn't have time to save himself. "Take them up," Mike commanded, his voice steady as he helped push the family clear of the collapsing edge. The words that followed would haunt Chase forever. "It's what he made us for, brother. To save others." The cliff crumbled. Mike's light disappeared into the darkness below. Chase's anguished cry echoed across the mountain as the family was pulled to safety. That night, he didn't just lose his best friend, he lost his faith. How could God let a man die saving others? It was the beginning of Chase's descent into darkness, but also the first step toward an extraordinary journey that would challenge everything he believed about life, death, and the power of faith. If you found value in this story of faith, hope, and redemption, please subscribe to join our community of believers. Together we can spread light and inspire healing in others. The years following Mike's death transformed Chase Dio from a decorated Air Force rescue specialist into a shadow of his former self. His impressive record spoke of countless lives saved, but numbers couldn't capture the weight of those he couldn't rescue, especially Mike. Chase had once been devoted to his faith, attending Grace Methodist Church every Sunday with his wife Sarah. Her unwavering belief had anchored him through the toughest missions. God put you where you're needed most, she would say, straightening his uniform before each deployment. But faith proved insufficient against the aggressive cancer that consumed Sarah 2 years after Mike's death. Chase watched helplessly as his beloved wife withered away despite their fervent prayers. When Sarah took her last breath, their daughter Emily clutching her hand, Chase felt the last remnants of his faith crumble. Emily, now a promising medical student at Johns Hopkins, bore the weight of both losses. She watched her father retreat into himself, his once warm eyes growing distant and cold. The man who had taught her courage now seemed afraid of living itself. Chase threw himself into his work as an emergency response trainer, pushing recruits to their limits. "Mercy gets people killed," he would tell his students, thinking of Mike's final sacrifice. The morning ritual at the Emergency Response Training Center began like any other. Chase arrived precisely at 5:30 a.m., his military punctuality unchanged by civilian life. The facility, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of Colorado Springs, had become more of a home than his empty house. His office walls displayed certificates and commendations, but conspicuously absent were any personal photos. No family, no friends, just proof of professional achievement. His newest class of trainees watched nervously as he strode into the simulation room. Chase's reputation preceded him, the toughest instructor in the program, known for pushing people to their breaking point. "In real emergencies, you don't get second chances," he would say, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. Some called him cruel, others called him thorough, but none could deny his expertise. Emily's latest text message remained unread on his phone. "Dad, I got the cardiology residency at Mass General. Would love to talk about it. He'd seen it 3 days ago, but couldn't bring himself to respond." Every achievement of hers reminded him of Sarah's dream for their daughter to become a doctor. The pride he felt was always tinged with an unbearable sadness. During lunch breaks, Chase would sit alone in his office, mechanically eating the same turkey sandwich while reviewing training protocols. His colleagues had long since stopped inviting him to join them. The wall he'd built around himself was too high, too thick for casual conversation to penetrate. Only his administrative assistant, Margaret, an elderly widow who'd lost her own son in Afghanistan, occasionally breached his defenses with cups of coffee and quiet concern. The physical symptoms of his depression manifested in subtle ways, the slight tremor in his hands that he attributed to too much caffeine, the headaches that grew more frequent, the sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling. His doctor had suggested counseling, even medication, but Chase dismissed both. "I've seen real trauma," he'd say. "This isn't that." At home, dusk gathered on Sarah's piano. Emily had begged him to at least hire someone to maintain it, but he couldn't bear the thought of anyone else touching it. The garden Sarah had lovingly tended now grew wild, beautiful in its abandon. Chase would sometimes stand at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the overgrown roses in shades of gold, Sarah's favorites. His neighbors had stopped trying to include him in community events. The annual block party, the Christmas caroling, the neighborhood watch meetings, Chase declined them all with polite but firm refusals. The only regular visitor was old Father Thomas from Grace Methodist, who would accidentally run into Chase during his morning runs. The priest never pushed, never preached, just offered a friendly nod and an open invitation that Chase never accepted. The isolation was beginning to show in physical ways. Gray had crept into his temples, lines deepened around his eyes, and his military posture occasionally slumped when he thought no one was watching. Yet he maintained a punishing exercise routine, running 5 miles every morning before work, as if trying to outpace his memories. In his most honest moments, usually late at night when the house felt too big and too quiet, Chase would admit to himself that he was afraid. Not of death, he'd faced that too many times to fear it, but of living, of opening himself up to loss again, of facing the God he'd once trusted so completely. It was easier to be the stern instructor, the distant father, the neighbor who kept to himself. But beneath the carefully constructed facade, something was shifting. Like hairline cracks in a dam, tiny fissures were appearing in the walls he'd built. A child's laughter would catch him off guard, reminding him of Emily's younger days. The sight of a rescue helicopter would bring back memories not just of Mike's last mission, but of all the lives they'd saved together. And sometimes in his dreams, Sarah would visit him, not sick and fading, but vibrant and whole, asking him why he'd stopped living when she died. These were the circumstances of Chase Dio's life when destiny, or divine intervention, decided it was time for him to face everything he'd been running from. No one, least of all Chase, could have predicted how dramatically things were about to change. The morning began with an unusual sense of foreboding. Chase woke before his alarm, his heart racing from a dream he couldn't quite remember. Sarah's voice lingered in his mind, urgently trying to tell him something. The November air felt heavy, charged with an electricity that made his skin prickle. During his morning run, everything seemed slightly off-kilter. The sunrise painted the sky in strange, deep crimsons that reminded him of blood. A flock of birds suddenly took flight as he passed, their wings creating shadows that seemed to reach for him. Even his trusted route felt unfamiliar, each step requiring more effort than usual. At the training center, Chase tried to shake off his unease by focusing on the day's schedule, a high-intensity rescue simulation for his advanced class. As he briefed the trainees, his vision briefly blurred, forcing him to grip the podium. Margaret noticed, placing a concerned hand on his arm, but he brushed her off with a curt "I'm fine." The simulation involved a complex scenario, multiple casualties in a collapsed structure. Chase had run this exercise hundreds of times, but today the dummy casualties looked too real, their plastic faces seeming to twist in genuine pain. His chest felt tight as he demonstrated proper lifting techniques, but he attributed it to the changing weather. During the lunch break, he received a call from Emily. For the first time in months, he felt an inexplicable urge to answer. His finger hovered over the green button, but pride won out. He'd call her back later, he told himself, not knowing there might not be a later. The missed call notification blinked accusingly on his screen. The afternoon session began with a review of emergency protocols. Chase stood before his class, explaining the critical importance of quick decision-making. In those final moments, he said, his voice unusually hoarse, "You might be someone's last chance at." The word survival died in his throat as a searing pain shot through his left arm. The fluorescent lights above seemed to pulse and dim. His students' faces blurred into indistinct shapes. Someone called his name, but it sounded distant, underwater. Chase tried to maintain his composure, to fight through what he assumed was simple exhaustion. He was Chase Dio, after all, the man who never showed weakness. "Sir, you don't look well." One of his senior students, James, stepped forward. Chase tried to wave him off, but the room began to spin. The pain in his chest intensified, becoming an iron band that squeezed tighter with each breath. He could hear Sarah's voice again, clearer now. "It's time to stop running, my love." His knees buckled. The polished floor of the training room rushed up to meet him. As his body crumpled, Chase caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. He looked just like Sarah did in her final moments, pale and struggling for breath. The irony wasn't lost on him even as consciousness began to fade. Voices erupted around him. His trainees, so well drilled in emergency response, sprang into action. He felt hands positioning him, checking his pulse, starting compressions. Through the chaos, Chase heard Margaret calling 911, her voice steady but threaded with fear. "Instructor down. Cardiac arrest. No, he's not breathing." In his last moments of awareness, Chase thought of Mike's final words. "It's what he made us for. Brother, a lifetime of running, of hiding from pain, of pushing away love, and here he was, surrounded by people he'd trained to save others, unable to save himself." The bitter poetry of it all would have made him laugh if he could. Then everything started to fade. The pain receded, replaced by a profound exhaustion. Chase could feel himself slipping away, like a tide pulling back from the shore. His last conscious thought was of Emily. He should have answered that call. The regret tasted like ashes in his mouth as darkness crept in from the edges of his vision. The last thing he heard was a student counting compressions. 1, 2, 3, then Chase Dio, the man who had spent years running from death, finally met it face to face. The first sensation was weightlessness. Chase felt himself floating above the training room floor, watching as his students worked frantically to revive his lifeless body. Their movements seemed slow, dreamlike, as if time itself had begun to warp. Margaret's tears fell in suspended droplets, catching the fluorescent light like tiny crystals. Then came the pull, not gentle, but violent and inexorable. Chase felt himself being drawn away from the scene below, away from the familiar world of light and order. The training room dissolved into darkness, a void so complete it seemed to have substance. The temperature plummeted, and an overwhelming sense of dread settled into what remained of his consciousness. The darkness wasn't empty. Shapes began to emerge, twisted and malevolent. They moved with a terrible purpose, their forms defying natural law. Chase tried to recoil, but there was nowhere to go. His military training, his years of facing danger meant nothing here. This was a different kind of terror, primal, absolute, and inescapable. The beings surrounding him seemed made of shadow and agony. Their bodies were contorted, flesh hanging in tatters, eyes burning with an unholy light. They reached for him with elongated limbs, their fingers ending in points that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. Their touch was like ice, burning and numbing simultaneously, each contact sending waves of despair through his soul. Voices filled the void, not the comforting sounds of human speech, but a cacophony of suffering. Screams layered upon screams, creating a symphony of torment that threatened to shatter his sanity. Chase recognized some of the voices. Mike, calling out in his final moments. Sarah, crying in pain during her last days as father, lost to alcoholism years ago. Each voice accused him, condemned him, reminded him of his failures. "You let us die," the voices whispered. "You turned away from faith, you abandoned hope. You belong with us now." The words weren't spoken so much as they were carved into his consciousness, each syllable a fresh wound. Chase wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the weight of truth in their accusations crushed his resistance. The beings pressed closer, their very presence seeming to feed on his growing despair. They showed him visions, every person he'd failed to save, every moment he'd chosen anger over forgiveness, every time he'd pushed Emily away when she needed her father most. The memories played out in excruciating detail, each one a testament to his unworthiness. Time lost all meaning in this place. What felt like centuries might have been seconds, what seemed like moments could have been years. Chase felt himself beginning to forget the warmth of sunlight, forget the sound of Emily's laughter, forget the feeling of Sarah's hand in his. The darkness was consuming him, not just his body but his very essence. The beings began to pull him deeper into their realm. Their claws dug into what passed for his flesh, though no blood flowed from the wounds. Instead, each tear seemed to rip away a memory, a hope, a piece of his humanity. Chase tried to pray, but the words crumbled before they could form. How could he call out to a God he had rejected? In this moment of utter desolation, Chase finally understood the magnitude of his mistakes. Not the human errors of failed rescues or missed opportunities, but the spiritual poverty of a life lived in denial of love. He had built walls to keep out pain, only to imprison himself. He had rejected faith to avoid disappointment, only to lose his connection to hope itself. The realization came too late. The darkness pressed in, threatening to extinguish the last spark of his consciousness. The being's grip tightened, their silent promise of eternal torment becoming more real with each passing moment. Chase felt himself giving in, surrendering to the horror of his situation. This, he thought, was what he deserved, an eternity of darkness for a life spent running from the light. But even as he accepted his fate, even as the last vestiges of hope slipped away, something changed. A pinpoint of light appeared in the infinite darkness, distant but undeniable. The beings saw it too, their grips loosening slightly as they recoiled from its radiance. The light grew stronger, piercing through the darkness like a blade through silk. The beings that had tormented Chase retreated, their forms dissolving into shadows as the radiance approached. The light wasn't just brightness, it carried warmth, love, and a presence so profound it brought Chase to his knees. From within the light emerged a figure, and Chase knew immediately who stood before him. Not through any physical recognition, but through an understanding that resonated in the depths of his soul. Jesus appeared, clothed in light itself, his presence both terrifying and comforting. Chase felt completely exposed, every sin and doubt laid bare, yet simultaneously wrapped in unconditional love. "My child," Jesus spoke, his voice resonating not through the air but directly into Chase's consciousness. "You have walked far from the path I set before you." The words carried no condemnation, only a sorrow so deep it brought fresh tears to Chase's eyes. "Your heart has grown hard, but not beyond redemption." Visions began to unfold around them. Chase saw the world as it truly was, not just the physical realm, but the spiritual battle raging beneath the surface. He witnessed scenes of impending disasters, natural catastrophes, wars, and conflicts that would tear humanity apart. But more devastating than the physical destruction was the spiritual desolation, millions of souls lost in darkness just as he had been. "Watch carefully," Jesus commanded, and the vision shifted. Chase saw people turning against each other, faith growing cold, love becoming a rare commodity. He saw children abandoned, the elderly forgotten, and compassion dying in the hearts of many. Each scene was more heartbreaking than the last, showing a world desperately in need of light. But then the visions changed again. Chase saw small acts of kindness creating ripples of hope. He watched as single individuals, standing firm in their faith, became beacons that guided others out of darkness. He saw how one person's testimony could transform countless lives, how a simple act of love could change the course of someone's eternity. "This is why I brought you here," Jesus explained, his voice filled with both authority and tenderness. "Not to punish you, but to show you what's at stake. The time is shorter than you think, Chase. The darkness you experienced is real, and it threatens to consume many who have lost their way." Chase tried to speak, to express his unworthiness, but Jesus raised his hand. "I don't call the qualified," he said, "I qualify the called. Your pain, your losses, even your doubts, I will use them all. Through your brokenness, others will find healing. Through your story, they will find hope." The visions continued, showing Chase glimpses of his own future, the challenges he would face, the opposition he would encounter, but also the lives that would be transformed through his testimony. He saw himself speaking to crowds, sharing his experience, helping others find their way back to faith. "It won't be easy," Jesus warned. "Many will doubt you. Some will mock you. Even those closest to you may turn away at first. But remember this moment. Remember that the darkness is real, but so is the light, and the light always overcomes the darkness." Jesus stepped closer, and Chase felt overwhelming love wash over him. Every moment of his life, Mike's death, Sarah's illness, his anger at God, was illuminated with new understanding. He saw how God had been present even in his darkest moments, how his suffering could be transformed into purpose. "The world needs warriors of light," Jesus said, placing his hand on Chase's shoulder. The touch sent waves of peace through his entire being. "Not perfect people, but broken vessels willing to carry my love to a hurting world. Will you accept this mission, Chase? Will you return and share what you've seen?" Before Chase could respond, Jesus showed him one final vision: Emily, kneeling by his hospital bed, praying for the first time since Sarah's death. The sight broke his heart and filled it with hope simultaneously. He saw how his story could bridge the gap between them, how his experience could heal not just their relationship but countless others. "Yes," Chase whispered, his voice thick with tears. "Yes, Lord, I'll go back, I'll tell him. Just give me the strength to do it." Jesus smiled, and the love in that smile contained the power that had created universes. "My strength is made perfect in weakness," he said. "Remember, you're not going back to prove anything. You're going back to love, to share, to be a light in the darkness you've seen." The light began to intensify, becoming almost unbearable in its brilliance. Chase felt himself being drawn back, away from Jesus' presence, but the love and purpose he'd received remained. As his consciousness began to shift, he heard Jesus' final words echoing through his soul. "Remember, Chase, the time is short, but love is eternal." The first breath felt like fire in his lungs. Chase's body convulsed on the hospital bed, machines blaring around him as consciousness slammed back into his physical form. Medical staff rushed in, their voices a chaotic blend of shock and professional urgency. "He's back. Blood pressure rising. Heart rate stabilizing. I don't believe it." Dr. Catherine Wilson, the attending physician who had pronounced him dead just minutes before, stood frozen in disbelief. Her years of medical experience hadn't prepared her for this. Chase had been clinically dead for 17 minutes, well beyond the point of likely brain damage. Yet, here he was, not only alive but fully conscious, his eyes wide and alert. Emily burst into the room, her white medical student coat still on from her hospital rotation. She had driven 4 hours straight when Margaret called about her father's collapse. Seeing him alive, her medical training warred with overwhelming emotion. "Dad," she cried, grabbing his hand. Chase gripped back with surprising strength, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his daughter with new eyes. "I saw her, Emily," he whispered hoarsely. "I saw your mother." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The medical staff exchanged uncomfortable glances, attributing his words to confusion or oxygen deprivation. But Emily saw something different in her father's face, a softness that had been missing since her mother's death. The next few hours were a blur of tests, examinations, and medical professionals struggling to explain the inexplicable. Chase's heart showed no sign of the massive damage that had stopped it. His brain scans were clear. Even his chronic back pain from an old military injury had vanished. Dr. Wilson kept using the word unprecedented as she reviewed his charts. But Chase was barely aware of the medical chaos around him. His mind was consumed by vivid memories of his experience, the darkness, the light, the presence of Jesus, and most importantly, the mission he'd been given. The urgency of his purpose pressed against his chest like a physical weight. When he tried to explain what he'd seen, the hospital staff's reactions ranged from diplomatic silence to obvious skepticism. Margaret arrived in the evening, bringing his personal effects and a concerned Father Thomas, who had heard about the incident. The old priest sat quietly by Chase's bed, watching as his former parishioner struggled to articulate his experience. When Chase mentioned Jesus, Father Thomas didn't smile or dismiss him. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Tell me everything," he said. As night fell, the stream of medical personnel finally slowed. Emily remained curled up in a chair beside his bed, her hand still holding his. Chase watched her sleep, remembering the vision of her praying. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, too softly to wake her. "I'm going to make it right." The hospital room's window offered a view of the city lights below. Chase stood shakily against medical advice and walked to the glass. The world looked different now, both more beautiful and more urgent. He could still see echoes of the visions Jesus had shown him, could still feel the weight of his mission. How could he make others understand what he'd seen? How could he convey the reality of both the darkness and the light? His reflection in the window caught him off guard. The hard lines of bitterness that had aged his face were gone, replaced by something softer, more peaceful. Yet there was also a new strength there, a purpose that straightened his shoulders despite his physical exhaustion. He was no longer running from his pain, he was being sent to help others through theirs. Dr. Wilson entered for one final check, finding him at the window. "Mr. Dio, you really should be resting," she advised, but her voice held more curiosity than authority. "I've never seen anything like your recovery in 30 years of medicine." She hesitated, then added, "Some of the staff are calling it a miracle." Chase turned from the window, meeting her gaze directly. It was, he said simply, "And it's not just for me." The doctor's expression remained professional, but something in her eyes suggested she wasn't entirely close to the possibility. She'd seen him dead, after all. Sometimes the most rational minds are the ones most shaken by the inexplicable. As midnight approached, Chase lay awake in his hospital bed, surrounded by the quiet beeping of monitors. Tomorrow, he knew, the real challenges would begin. People would want explanations he couldn't scientifically provide. They would doubt, question, and dismiss his experience. Some would call him crazy, others would accuse him of seeking attention. But none of that mattered now. He had seen the reality that lay behind the visible world. He had experienced the darkness that threatened to consume humanity, and he had been touched by a light powerful enough to overcome it. As sleep finally began to claim him, Chase held on to Jesus' final words, "The time is short, but love is eternal." The media attention began 3 days after Chase's miraculous recovery. Local news stations picked up the story of the Air Force veteran who had come back from death with an extraordinary tale. At first, the coverage was respectful, focusing on the medical mystery of his resurrection. Dr. Wilson's careful statements about unexplained phenomena lent credibility to the story, even as she avoided any mention of divine intervention. But the tone shifted when Chase began speaking openly about his experience. In his first television interview, he described the darkness, the beings, and his encounter with Jesus with unwavering conviction. The reporter's skepticism was palpable, her questions becoming increasingly pointed. Some might say these visions were simply the result of oxygen deprivation, she suggested. Chase's response was firm. "I know what I saw. This wasn't a hallucination, it was more real than anything I've experienced in life." The training center placed him on indefinite administrative leave, citing concerns about his mental fitness for duty. His students were forbidden from discussing his collapse or his subsequent claims. Even James, who had helped save his life, was instructed to decline all interview requests. The official statement mentioned only a medical emergency and ongoing recovery. Emily's initial support began to waver as the publicity affected her residency. During rounds, she overheard other doctors discussing her father's religious delusions. Her supervising physician pulled her aside one day, suggesting that stress and grief had finally caught up with her father. "There are excellent psychiatric facilities," he offered kindly. "Sometimes these episodes can be managed with proper medication." The local newspaper ran a series of articles examining Chase's past. They dug up old mission reports, focusing on the traumatic loss of his friend Mike. A psychologist was quoted suggesting that unresolved grief could manifest in religious experiences during near-death states. They painted a picture of a man broken by loss, desperate for meaning. The fact that Chase had abandoned his faith after his wife's death was presented as evidence of his emotional instability. Former colleagues began distancing themselves. People who had known him for years crossed the street to avoid conversation. The whispers followed him everywhere. "Did you hear about Chase? Such a shame. He was such a solid guy before. Guess everyone has a breaking point." The isolation might have broken him, if not for the absolute certainty of what he had experienced. The hardest blow came from his former commanding officer, Colonel Richards. The man who had awarded Chase his Silver Star now refused to meet with him. Through an aide, he conveyed his deep concern about Chase's mental state and suggested he seek professional help. The military community, once his strongest support system, began treating him like a liability. Social media amplified the criticism. Videos of his interviews were mocked, his words taken out of context. Internet trolls created memes about the crazy rescue instructor who found Jesus. Some suggested he had orchestrated the whole incident for attention or financial gain. Others claimed he was suffering from PTSD and needed intervention. His neighbor of 15 years, a retired nurse named Betty, started a petition to have him evaluated for mental competency. She cited his erratic behavior and religious propaganda as threats to community safety. The petition gathered hundreds of signatures, many from people who had never met him. The local police increased patrols past his house, watching him as if he might suddenly become dangerous. Chase's bank account began to suffer as speaking engagements were canceled. The emergency response community, which had once paid premium fees for his training expertise, now viewed him as a liability. Insurance companies refused to cover events where he was scheduled to appear, citing unstable conditions. Even Father Thomas, who had initially supported him, began to express doubts about the public nature of Chase's testimony. Perhaps a more private expression of faith would be more appropriate, he suggested gently. These claims about specific visions and messages, they make people uncomfortable. The church, which Chase had hoped would be a sanctuary, became another place of judgment. Emily's final breaking point came when her residency director suggested she take a leave of absence to deal with family matters. She arrived at Chase's house that evening, tears of frustration in her eyes. "Dad, you have to stop," she pleaded. "You're ruining everything, your career, your reputation, my career. If this is some kind of delayed grief about Mom, please get help, please." Chase looked at his daughter, remembering the vision of her praying by his hospital bed. "Emily," he said softly, "I saw your mother. She's with him in the light. She wants us to know she's at peace." But Emily was already walking away, her white coat a retreating flag of surrender in the gathering dusk. That night, alone in his house, Chase faced his first real test of faith since his return. The darkness he had experienced in death had been terrifying, but this isolation in life was its own kind of torment. Yet as he sat in his darkened living room, he felt again the warmth of Jesus' presence, heard again the words, "Many will doubt you. Some will mock you. Even those closest to you may turn away at first." The diagnosis came 6 months after his near-death experience. Chase had been ignoring the persistent cough, the unexplained weight loss, the night sweats. When he finally gave in to Margaret's concerned insistence and saw a doctor, the news was devastating: stage IV lung cancer, extensively spread. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had returned from death only to face it again. The medical bills started mounting immediately. His insurance, already strained by the previous hospital stay, denied coverage for experimental treatments. The training center had terminated his employment, citing his continued promotion of unverified religious experiences as harmful to their professional reputation. His savings, once substantial, began to dwindle under the weight of medical expenses. Chase sold his house first, the home where Sarah had played piano and Emily had grown up. He moved into a small apartment, but even that became unaffordable as the treatment costs escalated. His car, a reliable Toyota that had carried him to countless training sessions, became his new home. He parked in different locations each night, avoiding the pitying glances of former neighbors. The cancer treatment was brutal. Chemotherapy ravaged his body, turning the once strong rescue instructor into a shadow of himself. Yet even as his physical strength waned, Chase continued to share his testimony. He would speak in small church basements, homeless shelters, anywhere that would have him. His audience was no longer the respectable emergency response community, but society's outcast addicts, ex-convicts, the homeless. Emily's wedding invitation arrived during one of his chemotherapy sessions. The envelope felt heavy with unspoken words. Inside, a handwritten note: "Dad, I'm marrying David in June. I want you there, but only if you agree not to talk about your experience. Please just be my father for one day." Chase's hands trembled as he read it. Not from the chemo, but from the pain of his daughter's conditions. The cancer spread despite the treatments. Dr. Wilson, who had witnessed his miraculous revival, now had to deliver increasingly grim prognosis. "I don't understand," she confessed during one visit. "After what happened before, I thought." She left the thought unfinished, but Chase understood. Everyone had expected another miracle. Living in his car, Chase maintained a routine. He would wake early, use the YMCA showers when he could afford the membership fee, and spend his days between treatment sessions and speaking engagements. At night, he would park near the hospital, both for safety and because his deteriorating condition frequently required emergency care. The physical pain was constant, but it was the loneliness that tested his faith most severely. Each night, curled up in his back seat under donated blankets, Chase would remember the overwhelming love he had felt in Jesus' presence. The contrast between that divine embrace and his current isolation was almost unbearable. Yet he never doubted the reality of his experience, even as his body failed him. One particularly cold night, as Chase struggled to find a comfortable position in his car, he had a visitor. Father Thomas knocked on his window, holding 2 cups of coffee. The old priest had been tracking him down for weeks. "This isn't right," he said, sliding into the passenger seat. "Let the church help you. Whatever our doubts about your vision, you're still one of us." But Chase remembered Jesus' words about the path being difficult. He graciously declined the offer of church housing. His mission wasn't to be comfortable, it was to be faithful. Even as his body weakened, his spirit grew stronger. Each person who found hope through his testimony confirmed the purpose of his suffering. The lowest point came when Chase couldn't afford his next round of treatment. The hospital administration was sympathetic but firm without payment. They could only provide palliative care. As he sat in the parking lot, contemplating his options, he watched families coming and going, living their normal lives. For a moment, doubt crept in. Had it all been worth it? The loss of his career, his home, his daughter's respect, all for a story most people didn't believe. But then he remembered the darkness he had experienced, the souls trapped in torment. He thought of the visions Jesus had shown him, a world desperate for light and hope. His current suffering seemed small compared to the eternal consequences of remaining silent. Even if his time was short, even if his body was failing, he would continue to shine whatever light he could into the darkness. The betrayal came from where Chase least expected it. Mark Stevens, his former second-in-command at the training center and friend of 15 years, appeared on a national news program with explosive revelations about Chase's past. The interview aired on a Thursday evening just as Chase was finishing another round of chemotherapy. The truth is, Mark said, his face grave with manufactured concern, Chase has a history of fabricating stories for attention. He produced documents, training reports that had been altered, mission logs with discrepancies. After his wife died, we noticed changes in his behavior. He would embellish rescue stories, exaggerate his role in successful missions. The near-death experience is just his most elaborate fabrication yet. The accusations were masterfully crafted, mixing truth with lies in ways that made them impossible to fully refute. Mark revealed that Chase had once been reprimanded for claiming credit for a rescue that other team members had completed. What he didn't mention was that Chase had been in the hospital that day recovering from injuries sustained in a previous rescue. The media seized on the story with predatory enthusiasm. Overnight, Chase's testimony transformed from a curious spiritual tale to a calculated deception. Headlines screamed hero or fraud. The dark truth behind Air Force veterans' heavenly claims. Old colleagues emerged with their own stories, each one carefully twisted to support Mark's narrative. Emily called, her voice shaking with anger and hurt. "Did you lie about everything, Dad? Even about seeing Mom?" The doubt in her voice cut deeper than any physical pain. Before Chase could explain, she hung up. Hours later, he received a text, "Don't come to the wedding. I can't have my patient's family seeing you there." The final blow came when Mark revealed private conversations about Sarah's death, moments of grief and anger that Chase had shared in confidence. He blamed God for his wife's death, Mark told reporters. He said he'd make God pay for taking her. Now he's found a way to profit from people's faith in the divine. The fact that Chase had been living in his car, speaking for free at homeless shelters, somehow never made it into the narrative. The betrayal sparked a cascade of consequences. Local churches that had once welcomed him now closed their doors. Speaking invitations were rescinded. Even the homeless shelters became wary, concerned about being associated with a proven fraud. Chase's small but faithful audience began to dwindle as doubt crept into their minds. Dr. Wilson was forced to release a statement distancing herself from Chase's claims. While Mr. Dio's recovery was unusual, she said carefully, "We cannot verify any supernatural elements." The medical community used her statement to further discredit his experience, attributing everything to oxygen deprivation and psychological trauma. Father Thomas visited Chase in the hospital parking lot, where he still lived. The old priest's eyes were heavy with sadness. "Mark came to confession," he said quietly. "He admitted he was jealous of your influence, your ability to reach people. He twisted the truth out of envy. But I can't reveal that publicly. The seal of confession binds me." Chase sat in his car that night, physically and emotionally exhausted. The chemotherapy made him too weak to drive, too weak to defend himself against the avalanche of accusations. On his phone, social media exploded with mockery. Someone had created a meme of his hospital interview, overlaying it with angelic wings and a sarcastic halo. The worst part wasn't the public humiliation or the loss of his remaining credibility. It was knowing that Mark's betrayal would prevent people from hearing the truth about what lay beyond death. How many would turn away from faith because of these lies? How many would choose darkness because the light had been discredited? In his weakened state, Chase began to experience fever dreams that blurred the line between present suffering and remembered darkness. He saw again the tortured souls he'd encountered in death, but now they wore familiar faces: Mark, Emily, Dr. Wilson, all trapped in eternal torment because they'd rejected the truth he'd failed to convince them of. Margaret, who had been bringing him food when she could find him, discovered him delirious in his car. As she helped him drink some water, she whispered, "Why don't you fight back? Tell them about all the lives you really saved. Show them who you truly are." But Chase remembered Jesus' words about persecution and remembered that his mission wasn't to defend himself but to share what he had seen. The local news ran a final story about the fallen hero's descent into delusion, complete with psychiatric experts analyzing his break from reality. They showed footage of his car parked at the hospital, describing him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked religious mania. Not one reporter mentioned the people whose lives had been transformed by his testimony, or questioned why a man seeking profit would give away everything he owned. As autumn turned to winter, Chase found himself more alone than ever. His body ravaged by cancer, his reputation destroyed, abandoned by those he had trusted most. It seemed the darkness was winning after all. But in his moments of deepest despair, he would remember the light he had experienced, the love that had transformed him. No betrayal could take that away. Hope arrived in the form of a 12-year-old girl named Katie Lawrence, a heart patient at the same hospital where Chase received his chemotherapy. He first noticed her watching him from her wheelchair in the oncology garden, her pale face curious rather than judgmental. Unlike the adults who averted their eyes, Katie would smile and wave whenever she saw him. One cold morning, as Chase sat struggling to keep down water after his treatment, Katie wheeled herself over. "You're the man who saw Jesus, aren't you?" she asked without preamble. Before he could respond, she added, "I believe you. I've seen him too in my dreams when my heart gets really bad." Katie's parents, Tom and Linda Lawrence, were initially horrified to find their daughter talking to the notorious fraud from the news. But Katie was adamant. "He's not lying," she insisted with the pure conviction only children can muster. "His eyes look like mine did after my first surgery when I saw the angels." The Lawrences weren't wealthy. Tom worked as a janitor at the hospital, and Linda picked up night shifts at a diner to help pay for Katie's mounting medical bills. Yet they recognized something in Chase that went beyond the media's accusations. After learning he was living in his car, they began bringing him home-cooked meals, sharing whatever little they had. Katie started asking to schedule her treatments at the same time as Chase's. She would sit beside him during his chemotherapy sessions, drawing pictures of what she imagined his experience had been like. Her artwork was extraordinary, vivid depictions of light battling darkness, angels standing guard, Jesus reaching out with loving arms. The raw truth in her illustrations moved the hospital staff to tears. "You're not crazy," Katie told him one day, her small hand gripping his. The grown-ups are crazy for not seeing it. Her own heart condition was deteriorating, requiring more frequent hospitalizations, yet she remained a beacon of joy. She started sharing Chase's story with other patients, her innocent faith cutting through their skepticism. Through Katie, Chase found a new audience. Parents in the pediatric ward began seeking him out, asking him to share his experience with their sick children. Something about his presence brought peace to the terminal ward. Even the most hardened medical professionals couldn't deny the impact he had on their youngest patients. Katie's art teacher, M.S. Rodriguez, started an exhibition of her drawings in the hospital's children's wing. Visions of Hope, she called it. The local art community took notice. Suddenly, Chase's story was being told through the pure, unfiltered lens of a child's faith. The images spoke louder than any media accusations. When Katie's heart began to fail, the Lawrences insisted that Chase move into their small apartment. "Your family now," Linda said simply, tears in her eyes. "Katie needs you here." Despite their own financial struggles, they refused to let him return to his car. Their tiny living room became his bedroom, and their humble dining table his sanctuary. The transformation in the hospital community was subtle but significant. Nurses who had once avoided eye contact began to smile. Dr. Wilson started lingering after his treatments, asking thoughtful questions about his experience. The security guards who had watched him suspiciously now saved him parking spots close to the entrance. Katie's condition continued to worsen, but her spirit grew stronger. She organized a support group for young patients with Chase as the guest speaker. In that circle of sick children and worried parents, his story took on new meaning. He wasn't talking about death anymore, he was sharing hope with those who needed it most. One night, during a particularly bad episode, Katie whispered to Chase, "I'm not afraid anymore. I know what's waiting on the other side." Her parents, exhausted from worry, found comfort in Chase's presence. He shared with them not just his experience of the afterlife, but the peace that came with absolute certainty in God's love. The media tried to spin a new scandal about Chase exploiting sick children, but the hospital staff rallied to his defense. Dr. Wilson issued a statement about the measurable positive impact he had on pediatric patients' morale. The hospital chaplain spoke about the importance of hope and healing. Even some former critics began to question their judgment. Through Katie's simple faith and her family's unconditional acceptance, Chase found a new purpose. His testimony wasn't just about warning others about the darkness, it was about sharing the light with those who could still recognize it. In the faces of sick children finding courage, in the tears of grateful parents, in the quiet moments of shared faith, he saw what Jesus had meant about love being eternal. As winter deepened, Chase's cancer and Katie's heart condition both progressed. Yet in their shared suffering, they created something beautiful, a community of believers who saw past scandal to truth, who chose hope over cynicism, who found light in the darkest places. The Lawrences' tiny apartment became a gathering place for those seeking not just healing for their bodies, but peace for their souls. The cancer spread aggressively despite treatment. By early spring, Chase could no longer hide his deteriorating condition. His once strong frame had withered to barely 100 pounds, and the simple act of walking from the Lawrences' couch to the bathroom left him breathless. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about weeks, maybe days, their faces grave with professional sympathy. The hospital administration, pressured by budget constraints, informed him that his treatment options had been exhausted. Insurance had long since run out, and the experimental therapies that might have helped were financially out of reach. Even the palliative care unit had limits on how long they could keep him without payment. Emily's wedding was approaching, and the invitation still lay unopened on Katie's art table. Through Linda's quiet inquiries, Chase learned that his daughter had chosen to have Mark Stevens walk her down the aisle, a final betrayal that hurt more than any physical pain. The local news picked up the story, painting it as further proof of his disgrace. Discredited father replaced at daughter's wedding. Katie's condition was also worsening, and the timing seemed cruel. Both of them now spent more time in the hospital than out, their beds often side by side in the treatment room. The young girl's determination never wavered, even as her heart struggled. "We're going to see Jesus together," she would whisper to Chase during their shared sessions, her faith undimmed by suffering. The physical symptoms became increasingly severe. Chase developed pneumonia, his weakened immune system unable to fight off the infection. The fever dreams brought back vivid memories of the darkness he had experienced, but now, instead of fear, he felt a strange peace. He understood that death was not the end, even as his body moved inexorably toward it. Tom and Linda Lawrence exhausted their savings trying to help with his care, selling their car and taking extra shifts. Their dedication moved the hospital staff, but rules were rules. The administration gave Chase a final date. After that, they could only provide emergency services. The social worker suggested hospice, but even that required resources they didn't have. Dr. Wilson fought the system as much as she could, documenting every possible complication to justify extended care. But even she eventually had to deliver the news. "Chase, medically, there's nothing more we can do. I'm so sorry." Her clinical detachment cracked as she added, I wish we could prove what happened before. Maybe then." The pain became constant, a fire that burned through his bones. Morphine helped less and less, and Chase found himself sweating through nights that seemed endless. Yet even in his worst moments, he continued to share his testimony with anyone who would listen. Nurses would find him comforting other patients in the cancer ward, his voice weak but his spirit strong. Local churches, which had once shunned him, began sending representatives not to offer support, but to help him make peace with his lies. Before death, Chase received them with grace, recognizing in their judgment the same skepticism he had once held. Some left shaken by his unwavering certainty in the face of death. One particularly difficult night, as Chase struggled for breath, Katie's monitor began to alarm. The staff rushed her to intensive care, leaving Chase alone with his pain and worry. In that dark hour, he experienced again the overwhelming presence he had felt during his near-death experience, not as a full vision, but as a warm assurance that everything was proceeding according to plan. Margaret, who had remained faithful throughout his ordeal, found him the next morning with tears streaming down his face. Not tears of pain or fear, but of joy. "It's all true," he told her, his voice barely a whisper. Every word, and soon they'll understand. She held his hand, finally allowing herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the impossible was possible. The doctors gave their final estimates days at most. Chase's body was shutting down organ by organ. Yet those who visited him remarked on the strange light in his eyes, the peaceful smile that seemed at odds with his physical condition. Even the most hardened skeptics found themselves unsettled by his serenity in the face of imminent death. Emily's wedding day dawned bright and clear, a perfect June morning that seemed to mock Chase's absence. From his hospital bed, he watched the clock tick through the hours when his daughter would be walking down the aisle without him. Linda had brought him a small piece of wedding cake, sneaked out by a sympathetic catering assistant, but he couldn't bring himself to touch it. The local newspaper published a photo of the ceremony, Emily radiant in white, Mark Stevens proudly by her side. The article mentioned the tragic circumstances that had led to the father of the bride's absence, implying that his mental state had made it impossible for him to attend. No one mentioned that he had been explicitly uninvited, his presence deemed too controversial for the society wedding. Katie's condition reached a critical point that same week. The doctors moved her to intensive care, her small body fighting against her failing heart. Tom and Linda were stretched between caring for their daughter and supporting Chase, their faces lined with exhaustion and worry. The hospital staff began preparing them for the inevitable, using gentle words like comfort care and making her comfortable. Public mockery reached new heights when a popular late-night show host made Chase's story the subject of his monologue. The comedian mimed talking to Jesus, drawing laughs from the audience with exaggerated gestures and fake revelations. The clip went viral, spawning countless memes and parodies. Chase's testimony, once powerful in its sincerity, became a national joke. Dr. Wilson, who had long balanced professional skepticism with personal doubt, finally succumbed to peer pressure. In a medical journal article, she attributed Chase's previous recovery to unexplained but natural phenomena, explicitly rejecting any supernatural explanation. Her betrayal, though cushioned in academic language, left Chase more isolated than ever in the medical community. Father Thomas made one final attempt to bring Chase back into the church fold, offering to arrange a private recanting of his claims. "You could die with the comfort of the sacraments," the old priest pleaded. Isn't that better than holding on to this story? The suggestion that he would deny his experience, even for the comfort of his faith community, struck Chase as the cruelest blow yet. The nights grew longer and darker. Chase's pain medication was reduced due to budget constraints, leaving him to face the hours of darkness with only his memories of divine light to sustain him. The other patients in the ward began requesting moves to different rooms, uncomfortable with his presence and the stream of media attention it still attracted. Social services conducted a final evaluation, determining that Chase was suffering from terminal delusions. Their report recommended psychiatric intervention, though his physical condition made it impractical. The document's clinical dismissal of his entire experience felt like a final judgment from the world he was leaving behind. Margaret, his last regular visitor besides the Lawrences, brought him his mail one evening, a thick envelope that turned out to be divorce papers from Emily's wedding. His daughter had taken her new husband's name, legally severing the last tie to her father. The papers trembled in Chase's weakened hands as he realized she hadn't even signed them herself. They had come from her lawyer. In his moments of greatest despair, Chase began to question not his experience that remained more real than his present suffering, but his understanding of it. Had he failed in his mission? Had his testimony pushed more people away from faith than toward it? The darkness he had witnessed in death seemed to have followed him back to life, claiming not just his body but his legacy. The hospital chaplain, passing by late one night, heard Chase praying, not for himself but for all those who had rejected his story. Emily, Mark, the doctors, the church. "Forgive them," he whispered into the darkness, echoing words spoken on another cross long ago. "They don't understand what they're choosing." The chaplain hurried away, unsettled by the parallel. As Chase's strength ebbed and Katie's monitors beeped their ominous rhythm down the hall, it seemed that darkness had won after all. His story would die with him, dismissed as the ramblings of a broken man. The light he had been sent to share had been rejected, ridiculed, and finally forgotten. The revelation began with an overnight nurse named Hannah Chin, who had been quietly documenting irregularities in both Chase's and Katie's medical readings. Working the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, she had noticed patterns that defied medical explanation, moments when their vital signs synchronized perfectly, instances where their heart monitors showed identical rhythms despite their different conditions. Dr. Wilson, driven by scientific curiosity, began reviewing Chase's original case file from his near-death experience. The medical data from that day told an impossible story. The EEG readings during his 17 minutes of clinical death showed patterns that shouldn't have existed: complex brain activity when there should have been nothing. More surprisingly, his current cancer scans revealed something extraordinary: the tumors were changing in ways that contradicted known medical science. A young medical researcher, Dr. James Morrison, became intrigued by Hannah's observations. He set up additional monitoring equipment, capturing data that showed inexplicable energy patterns around both Chase and Katie during their shared treatment sessions. When the results were replicated under controlled conditions, even the most skeptical staff members struggled to dismiss the findings. The breakthrough came when Dr. Wilson presented the accumulated evidence at a closed medical conference. The data was clear: Chase's original revival had altered his physical body in measurable ways. His cellular structure showed changes that defied current biological understanding. More importantly, these changes appeared to be affecting those around him, particularly Katie. Katie's latest heart scans revealed something that stunned her cardiac team. The previously irreparable damage to her heart showed signs of regeneration, minimal but definitive. When compared with Chase's presence in her room, the improvements corresponded perfectly with their time together. The medical community couldn't explain it, but they couldn't deny it either. Mark Stevens chose this moment to suffer a crisis of conscience. After weeks of sleepless nights and mounting guilt, he walked into the hospital administrator's office with a confession. The documents he had used to discredit Chase were forgeries. His testimony about Chase's fabrications had been false, driven by jealousy and fear. He provided proof of his deception, including emails that showed a coordinated effort to destroy Chase's credibility. The hospital's legal team, reviewing the evidence of both the medical anomalies and Mark's confession, faced a difficult decision. The data suggested something beyond current scientific understanding was occurring within their walls. Dr. Wilson's reputation and career were on the line as she prepared to publish her findings in a prestigious medical journal. Local news stations, initially reluctant to revisit the story, couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. They began broadcasting updates about the miraculous readings from room 414, where Chase and Katie continued their unlikely journey together. Medical experts were interviewed, struggling to explain the inexplicable data in scientific terms. Father Thomas, reviewing his earlier doubts, brought forward a collection of similar cases from church history, documented instances where intense spiritual experiences had produced measurable physical changes. The parallel evidence supported Chase's account in ways that could no longer be ignored by the religious community. The medical board convened an emergency session to discuss the implications of Dr. Wilson's findings. The evidence forced them to confront an uncomfortable possibility: perhaps there were aspects of human existence that current medical science couldn't fully explain. The board's preliminary report, carefully worded but revolutionary in its implications, acknowledged that Chase's case presented legitimate phenomena worthy of serious scientific investigation. When the first peer-reviewed papers were published, complete with detailed medical data and independently verified readings, the scientific community was forced to take notice. The evidence didn't prove the reality of Chase's spiritual experience, but it proved something had happened, something that had fundamentally altered his physical body in ways that current medical knowledge couldn't explain. Dr. Wilson, standing before her colleagues in the hospital auditorium, finally said what many had begun to suspect: we're witnessing something that challenges everything we think we know about life, death, and the human capacity for healing. Whatever happened to Chase Dio that day, it was real. The data demands we acknowledge that. Emily's journey back to her father began with a phone call from Dr. Wilson. As a medical resident herself, she couldn't dismiss the evidence her mentor presented. The data wasn't just compelling, it was undeniable. Reviewing her father's medical files with a doctor's eye, she began to understand that something extraordinary had indeed occurred. Mark Stevens' public confession aired on the same network that had broadcast his accusations. His voice shaking, he revealed the full extent of his deception. "I couldn't handle the way people were drawn to his story," he admitted. "I watched him lose everything because of my lies, and I can't carry that guilt anymore." The confession reached millions, including Emily's new in-laws, who had been among Chase's strongest critics. The hospital community's transformation was profound. Nurses who had once avoided Chase's room now lingered to talk. Doctors brought their difficult cases to him, not for medical advice, but for the inexplicable peace his presence seemed to bring their patients. The security guard who had once watched him suspiciously now greeted him as the man who came back with proof. Katie's artwork gained new significance as medical professionals began correlating her drawings with the recorded energy patterns. Her childlike depictions of light and healing matched the data in ways that couldn't be coincidental. Art therapists and neurologists collaborated to study her work, finding patterns that suggested she was capturing something real rather than imagined. The Lawrence family became overnight celebrities, but they handled the attention with grace. Linda and Tom shared their story of simple faith and unconditional acceptance, touching hearts across the nation. Their humble apartment, which had sheltered Chase at his lowest point, became a testament to the power of believing in someone when the whole world doubts him. Father Thomas organized a reconciliation service at Grace Methodist Church. The congregation that had once shunned Chase now filled the pews to capacity, many in tears as their former brother in faith was welcomed home. The old priest's sermon that day was simple. Sometimes God's truth comes in ways we're not prepared to accept. Our doubt doesn't make it less true. Emily's arrival at the hospital marked the most profound moment of vindication. She found her father in Katie's room, both of them drawing pictures together despite their weakness. The medical equipment around them told the story. Her scientific mind now accepted something miraculous was happening here. "Daddy," she whispered, using the name she hadn't spoken in years. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you." The media narrative shifted dramatically. Reporters who had mocked Chase's story now sought exclusive interviews about the medical evidence. But Chase, growing weaker by the day, shared his spotlight with Katie. Together they told a story not just of life after death, but of faith that transcended physical suffering and doubt that transformed into belief. Local churches began organizing prayer vigils outside the hospital. The same community that had once signed petitions against Chase now gathered to pray for his healing. Their voices raised in hymns drifted up to his window, carrying the message that faith, once rejected, had found its way home. Dr. Wilson arranged for a special conference where Chase, despite his weakened state, shared his complete testimony. Medical professionals, religious leaders, and skeptics alike listened in stunned silence as he described both his divine encounter and the darkness he had witnessed. The evidence backing his experience transformed an incredible story into something that demanded serious consideration. The hospital administrator who had once threatened to remove Chase now worked to establish a special research unit dedicated to studying the phenomena around him and Katie. Some things, she admitted publicly, are bigger than our current understanding of medicine. Chase's vindication came not through anger or revenge, but through the quiet power of truth revealed in its own time. As Emily held his hand and Katie drew another picture of light overwhelming darkness, he understood that this too had been part of the mission. His suffering had created a bridge between faith and science, between doubt and belief, between a father and his daughter. The transformation began in Katie's room on a quiet Sunday morning. Her monitors, which had been showing increasingly concerning readings, suddenly stabilized. The change was so dramatic that Dr. Wilson rushed to verify the equipment wasn't malfunctioning. Instead, she found Katie sitting up in bed, her eyes bright with an inner light that hadn't been there before. At the same time, Chase's latest scans revealed something inexplicable. His tumors were shrinking. Not just shrinking, but disappearing in a pattern that defied medical understanding. Dr. Morrison's team worked around the clock, documenting every aspect of what they began calling the restoration. The medical community watched in amazement as both patients began showing signs of recovery that could only be described as miraculous. Emily, who had taken leave from her residency to be with her father, witnessed the changes firsthand. Her medical training couldn't explain what she was seeing, but her renewed faith helped her accept it. She moved back into her childhood home, working with contractors to restore Sarah's garden and tune the long silent piano. The house that had stood as a monument to loss became a symbol of healing and new beginnings. The Lawrences' simple apartment transformed into an unofficial sanctuary. People began gathering there daily, drawn by the story of unwavering faith and unconditional love. Tom and Linda, still working their humble jobs, became unexpected spiritual counselors to those seeking hope in their own darkness. Their example of quiet faith touched more lives than any televised miracle could have. Dr. Wilson established the Center for Spiritual and Medical Research, with Chase and Katie as its first documented cases. The center attracted researchers from around the world, all seeking to understand the connection between faith, healing, and the human spirit. Emily joined the research team, combining her medical expertise with her restored faith to bridge the gap between science and spirituality. Katie's art became the centerpiece of a new therapy program for terminal patients. Her drawings, which had once been dismissed as childish fantasies, now hung in hospitals across the country. Children in cancer wards drew their own versions of her visions, and doctors began noticing a correlation between artistic expression and healing rates. Chase's strength returned gradually, but his spirit soared. He no longer needed to convince anyone of his experience. The evidence spoke for itself. Instead, he focused on helping others understand the deeper message that love transcends death, that faith can bridge any divide, and that even the darkest moments can lead to light. Mark Stevens found his own path to redemption. After his confession, he dedicated himself to correcting the damage he had caused. He established a foundation to help people who had lost everything because of others' lies, naming it after Mike Sullivan, the friend whose sacrifice had started Chase's journey. The foundation became a lifeline for those fighting to rebuild their reputations and their faith. The hospital chapel, once nearly empty, now held daily services that brought together medical staff, patients, and visitors. Father Thomas, with Chase's encouragement, developed a program that helped people integrate their spiritual experiences with their medical journeys. The old priest's eyes would fill with tears as he watched doctors and nurses joining their patients in prayer. Emily's medical practice evolved to include both physical and spiritual healing. She began documenting cases similar to her father's, creating a database of experiences that challenged the boundary between science and faith. Her wedding ring, which had once represented her separation from her father's beliefs, now reminded her that love and truth would always find their way home. The local community, which had once shunned Chase, now sought his wisdom. The same neighbors who had signed petitions against him brought their troubles to his door, finding in his recovered strength a testament to the power of enduring faith. The police officer who had watched his house now guarded it from the crowd seeking healing and hope. As spring bloomed again in Sarah's restored garden, Chase sat with Katie on the porch swing, watching Emily play her mother's piano through the window. The music drifted out into the evening air, carrying with it the promise of healing that went beyond the physical. They had all been transformed not just in body but in spirit. 5 years after Chase's miraculous recovery, the Center for Spiritual and Medical Research had documented over 1,000 cases of unexplainable healings. But beyond the medical data, a more profound transformation had taken root. The center's waiting room displayed Katie's original artwork alongside testimonials from people whose lives had been changed not just by physical healing but by renewed hope. Emily's daughter, named Sarah after her grandmother, grew up watching her grandfather share his story with quiet conviction. She would sit on his lap in the garden, asking to hear again about the light and the darkness, about Jesus' love, and about how faith could change everything. Through her child's eyes, the extraordinary became natural and the miraculous became possible. Katie, now a healthy teenager, established art therapy programs in children's hospitals across the country. Her foundation, Drawing Light, helped young patients express their own spiritual experiences through art. Medical professionals began incorporating these programs into their treatment protocols, recognizing that healing often extended beyond the physical realm. The Lawrence family's humble example inspired a movement of radical hospitality. Churches and community groups established networks to support people facing crises of faith or health. Their motto, borrowed from Linda's simple wisdom, became, "When you can't believe for yourself, Let others believe for you until you can. Dr. Wilson's research eventually earned her a Nobel Prize, not for proving the existence of the divine, but for documenting the measurable effects of faith on physical healing. In her acceptance speech, she said simply, "Science doesn't negate faith, it helps us understand its fingerprints on our reality." Mark Stevens' redemption story became as powerful as Chase's original testimony. His foundation helped thousands rebuild their lives, and his annual reconciliation conferences brought together people who had been divided by lies and misunderstandings. He and Chase together demonstrated how truth and forgiveness could transform even the deepest betrayal. Father Thomas, in his final sermon before retiring, spoke about witnessing a modern-day resurrection not just of bodies but of faith, hope, and community. The church that had once closed its doors to Chase now operated a healing ministry that welcomed doubters and believers alike, recognizing that everyone's journey to faith was unique. Emily's medical practice became a model for integrative healing. She trained a new generation of doctors to listen not just to patients' bodies but to their spirits. Her research papers, combining rigorous science with openness to the inexplicable, helped establish a new field of study: spiritual medicine. The old neighborhood that had once shunned Chase became known as a place of healing. People moved there seeking not miracles, but the kind of community that could believe in miracles while loving those who couldn't. Garden parties in Sarah's restored rose garden became celebrations of life, faith, and the power of enduring love. On quiet evenings, Chase could still be found sitting with Katie on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded them both of heaven's light. They would talk about their shared journey, about the darkness they had faced and the light that had overcome it. Their bond remained unexplainable by medical science, but perfectly understood by those who had witnessed love's power to heal. The final lines of Chase's autobiography, published on the 10th anniversary of his near-death experience, summed up his message: the greatest miracle isn't surviving death or beating cancer. It's learning that love is stronger than fear, that light always overcomes darkness, and that faith, even when rejected, mocked, or beaten, will always find its way home. We are all on this journey together, and none of us walks alone. His story continues to transform lives, not because it proves the existence of heaven or hell, but because it demonstrates the power of unwavering faith, unconditional love, and the courage to speak truth, even when the whole world doubts. In the end, Chase Dio's legacy wasn't just his testimony about what lies beyond death, it was his living proof that love, faith, and truth can transform even the darkest circumstances into light. If this story of faith, hope, and redemption has touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments below. How has Chase's journey affected your own perspective on life, death, and faith? Support our team by subscribing to receive more powerful stories of transformation and healing. Every like helps us reach more people who need to hear these messages of hope. Share this video with friends and family who might be struggling with their own faith or facing difficult times. Together we can spread light and remind others that they're never alone in their spiritual journey. Your engagement helps us continue creating meaningful content that changes lives.